outfit is stupid?
What are you talking about? You look fine.
I just get like really insecure sometimes.
Yeah, I feel that.
Right? But it all stems from the fact that when my mom and my dad got a divorce, my dad convinced me that it was my fault, and I believed him for like 3 years. I'm gonna go get changed.
What? I don't relate to that part at all. You never told me this.
For Mamma Mia, I'm your host, Ashani Dante. Welcome to But Are You Happy? The podcast where overthinking finally gets the airtime it deserves.
And I'm Dr Anastasia Hronis, a clinical psychologist passionate about happiness and mental health. Have you ever said things like trauma dump or casually claimed, I'm traumatised? We've actually touched on this before, how the word trauma has become kind of a buzzword these days.
Oh, totally. I've definitely had to stop myself from overusing those terms.
It's become a part of everyday language, but today I want to unpack what trauma really means, what PTSD looks like, and share some ways that people can get support. We will be talking about trauma, so do listen mindfully.
This is going to be a good one. Let's start learning. Okay, Anastasia, let's cut to the chase. Trauma is a word we're hearing everywhere right now, from therapy rooms, social media, to also just casually in conversations with friends. So I would love to hear from your lens, the psychologist, what actually is trauma?
Yes, let's unpack the word, the term. Before I jump into talking about trauma though, I want to say this whole episode, I guess the point of it, at least from my perspective, is for us to help listeners build literacy around trauma, right? It's not about saying you do have trauma, you don't have trauma. It's not the Trauma Olympics. We're not comparing traumas, right? We really want to kind of come about it sensitively. And the goal is to build an understanding and a literacy around the topic, okay? What I'm going to describe won't necessarily fit every single person's experience. As we know, with anything mental health related, it impacts people differently. But if we unpack the word trauma, it comes from the Greek.
Once again.
The Greeks.
The Greeks are on it.
Drama, right? That's just me. That's just a flex.
In a Greek way too. It's like you are Greek.
It's like I am Greek. But a trauma literally means a wound, right? So if we just think physically for a moment, if we take away the psychological element of trauma, if we just think physically, if we go to a hospital, there'll be a trauma ward, right? So this is for anyone who has been wounded physically. When we talk about trauma in the mental health sense, we're talking about psychological wounds, okay? So psychological wounds actually function very similarly to physical wounds, right? If I burn my arm and then someone touches it before it's healed, that's probably going to feel quite painful. And it's probably going to be more painful if I have third-degree burns versus first-degree burns, right? So the worse my wound is, the worse my trauma is, the more it's going to hurt when someone touches it. Now, that applies psychologically. If I have a psychological wound as a result of experiencing something in my life and someone pokes it or prods it, if someone says something to me that triggers it, that's where the word kind of trigger falls into all this, it's going to activate that wound and it's going to hurt.
It's so interesting because as you're saying that, it reminds me of when we were speaking about rejection, the episode we did on rejection, and we did unpack wounds, but I actually didn't know trauma meant wounds.
Yes, absolutely.
It's always connected.
So if I kind of flesh it out a little bit more, trauma is a psychological wound, but it's essentially the emotional, the psychological or physical response to events or circumstances that have been extremely stressful, frightening, distressing or threatening in some way. And a person in those situations feels so overwhelmed that they feel they cannot cope. And so that psychological wound is formed as a result of the experiences they go through. Now, there are different types of trauma, right? In the world of mental health, we sometimes talk about big T, little t traumas.
Oh, yeah, I've heard that term.
Yeah. So when we talk about big T trauma, so this is T with a capital T, we're talking about those events and circumstances that are undeniably traumatic, right? So things like domestic violence, things like, growing up in poverty, things like abuse, right? Things that we wouldn't question whether they were traumatic events. But trauma isn't just necessarily what happens to us, but kind of psychologically how we cope with those events, right? They're the big T traumas, but we can also think about trauma with the lowercase t. And this isn't to say that it's a lesser trauma or anything like that, but these are emotional traumas or attachment traumas. A lot of these develop very early in life. We've talked before about needs, psychological needs, emotional needs. So trauma can also develop when a young child doesn't have their emotional needs met early in life. And this doesn't necessarily mean that they're exposed to abuse or anything like that. They might actually come from a very loving family, but for whatever reason, that child didn't have their need for love, support, validation, empathy met in their early years. And so they develop this emotional wound. And that's really important because that attachment trauma, that emotional trauma stays with them through their life and can absolutely impact them in adulthood.
So where does PTSD come into all of this?
So PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, is what it stands for. It's a diagnosable mental health condition. So not everyone who experiences trauma will develop PTSD.
Right.
But everyone who has PTSD has experienced trauma. Okay. So it's a very specific diagnosable mental health condition. And there's a few criteria that I'll talk you through for how we diagnose PTSD. So someone has experienced a traumatic event or a series of traumatic events where there has been either a real kind of threat to their life or a perceived threat to their life. And what we find is that there are a whole range of symptoms like flashbacks, nightmares, re-experiencing symptoms. So I might just sort of be suddenly sitting in this chair and all of a sudden I feel like I'm back in that trauma experience. Wow. We see a lot of kind of negative beliefs that develop about a person's self or the world that they live in or other people. We see a lot of avoidance patterns. So naturally, people will start to avoid things that remind them of the traumas. And there'll also be difficulties with mood and regulating mood.
So does that mean someone who has PTSD would avoid a certain situation from playing out again? So what I mean is, let's say a traumatic event happened in a specific suburb, right? Does that mean they'll forever avoid that specific suburb?
So often in the healing process and the treatment, we try to gradually get a person to stop avoiding those things. Now, the avoidance can be physical avoidance. So it might be, as you said, I avoid going to a particular area because that's where the trauma happened. Yeah. But it can also be an avoidance of internal experiences. Okay. So I might avoid, certain feelings, or I cut off when I experience certain feelings because they remind me of the trauma, or I avoid thinking about certain things. I sort of like push them away as much as I possibly can because they again remind me of the trauma and I want to avoid that. So we might practically avoid things, but we might also internally avoid certain experiences.
So you mentioned something around flashbacks and people going back to the moment where the trauma played out. Can you speak more to that?
Yes. So this is what we call re-experiencing symptoms. And this is quite specific to PTSD. So again, people who have trauma but don't have PTSD will not necessarily have these re-experiencing symptoms. So these are episodes that really kind of take over a person. They can be very scary when someone is in the middle of it, and they come about without warning. That's, I think, what the scary part is for a lot of people. So, they'll just be suddenly like driving down the street or sitting at home watching telly, and all of a sudden they have this flooding of reminders of the trauma, and they have very vivid kind of memories and sensory experiences that remind them of the trauma, that it almost feels like they're back in it. That's how strong and overwhelming it is. So it could be triggered by something like a smell. It could be triggered by hearing someone's name. It could be triggered by an internal feeling that they have, but it's very overwhelming. And it's got to do with how trauma memories are sort of encoded in the brain.
Look, the way that I want to word this, I want to make sure that I'm being really sensitive to anyone that does have PTSD. But when it comes to re-experiencing, do you feel like time does heal? Like, you know, from 1 year to 5 years, like the way that you would relate to that event would be really different, right?
Yes and no.
Yeah.
People who have PTSD, so they have these very specific symptoms, time does not necessarily heal.
Right. Okay.
So I've certainly seen people who have untreated PTSD. They come to the clinic. Their traumatic experience happened 5-10 years ago, and they are still experiencing these flashbacks, these nightmares, these very strong re-experiencing symptoms. We see it a lot with people who are first responders, who've been maybe like in the police force, veterans, or people who've experienced severe trauma, where if it goes untreated, it doesn't necessarily get better on its own. For people who have trauma and don't have those specific PTSD symptoms, there can certainly be that experience for some people that with time, different perspectives develop, different kind of healing processes might naturally occur for a person, and their relationship with the trauma can change.
So I've heard the term complex PTSD. Is there a difference between that and PTSD?
Yes, lots of terms.
Lots
I'm
of
glad that
terms.
we're unpacking them.
We
yes.
are.
So complex PTSD is really where we're talking about someone who has experienced multiple, sometimes kind of prolonged or repeated exposures to trauma. So this might be, for example, someone who's had repeated experiences of trauma in their childhood, someone, again, who's a first responder, who's had repeated exposures to trauma. So when we're talking about PTSD and trauma, it doesn't have to be that there's been a threat to someone, but that they've perhaps witnessed trauma. So when we think about, like, you know, paramedics, for example, they're constantly being exposed to and witnessing trauma. And I know they themselves can be in some risky situations as well. But even that aside, just the kind of witnessing trauma has that cumulative effect. And that absolutely impacts someone and can disrupt a person's kind of sense of self and sense of self in the world as well.
So it's really interesting because for me personally, probably about 15 years ago, I got into a car accident and it was pretty bad. It was like a head-on collision. I broke a couple of bones in my wrist, fractured top rib, collapsed lung. So it was pretty big deal. I've never been in a car accident before. And I remember, you know, going through the healing process and did all the things. I got surgery and all of that. And eventually, once I was able to get back into the car and drive independently, and I felt fine. But it's really interesting because even now, when I'm in the passenger seat and Yo, who's my husband, he might be driving, because my reflexes are probably a little bit faster than his. So I still do get a bit hypervigilant in the car and my body goes into reaction mode because I'm like, oh no. But it's interesting because I wonder, because my mind's like, oh, I can drive, it's all good. But then my body's doing something different, you know, there's some dissonance going on, you know. So yeah, I just find that really fascinating.
You know what you're reminding me of, which I think is so relevant to trauma, it's control, right? And I think what trauma really does to people is, in no uncertain terms, highlights how little control we have in life, right? So when someone goes through trauma, it is an absolute message of things can happen to us without our choice, without our consent, and without our control. And we are vulnerable to that. Yeah. Really, no one chooses to go through trauma, right? It kind of happens to us without our choice, without our consent. So if someone's in a car accident, they're not choosing that. If someone goes through abuse, they're not choosing that. It happens to them. And so it doesn't surprise me that when you say you're in the passenger seat, you might feel more anxious or more hypervigilant because you have less control in that situation, as opposed to maybe when you're behind the wheel. Totally.
And it's like, I fully trust Yo and his driving abilities. Like, we haven't got into a car accident, and bless him, he's so patient with me as well. But it is really fascinating. Hey.
Yeah. And you said it happened a number of years ago, right? The brain and the body, I mean, they're fascinating things. They're interconnected. But, you know, as the book says, the body keeps the score.
Yeah.
The body does keep the score.
It really does.
Yeah. I think it's fascinating to think about trauma and what actually happens in the brain and the body when we go through trauma. And I love a bit of neuroscience, so maybe we can unpack that.
We love us some neuroscience from
Yes.
Anastasia.
So let's talk a couple of things. First of all, let's talk trauma and cortisol. Okay, so cortisol is a hormone. We all have cortisol. It's in the body. It helps regulate kind of bodily functions. Cortisol is produced in our adrenal glands, which sit just above our kidneys. Okay, and so cortisol does lots of things. It helps with our blood pressure. It helps with sugar levels. It helps with inflammation in the body. Like, it does a whole range of things. But during a stressful event, cortisol is released. And it prepares our body for that fight or flight moment, right? It also sort of, you know, our body also kind of stops doing other things like digestion and things that are not necessary when we need to kind of prepare to fight, right? So we want all like kind of our blood flow to go to our extremities to prepare us to either run away or fight off the threat, okay? And cortisol is absolutely activated during stress and trauma. It's also kind of, it stays elevated for a period of time afterwards, and then it helps us kind of re-regulate our system. What we find for people who have been through repeated instances of stress or trauma is that their cortisol system becomes overly active, like it's being activated too much. And people can end up having some kind of chronic health conditions as a result of this. They can end up with headaches, digestive issues, cardiovascular issues, a whole range of things if cortisol is being activated too frequently in our body.
Is that kind of usually why, like, people get burnt out as well because the cortisol levels are spiked?
It's what happens during burnout.
Yeah.
So it's not just trauma, but it's kind of a chronic stress.
Yeah.
So if someone's just in a, you know, as we talked about in our burnout episode, a state of stress for a long period of time, whether that's with work, whether that's with life, whatever it might be, our system as it relates to cortisol kind of goes out of whack.
Okay, so that's what's happening in the body. Well, what's going on in the brain? Tell us more about what's going on there.
I find this bit fascinating. Okay, so the way in which trauma memories are stored in the brain is different to how other memories are stored in the brain. Okay, so when we are in a stressful situation, when we're in a traumatic situation, different parts of the brain work differently, okay? So the hippocampus, which is the part of the brain that helps us with storing memories generally, it's sort of underactive. And the amygdala, which is the part of the brain that is very much involved with emotions and senses, it's heightened, right? It's on alert. And so what happens as a result of that is that when we go through a traumatic experience, we encode very specific parts of the trauma memory very deeply. So people who go through trauma will often say, I can remember the smell of the shop that I was in when the trauma happened, or I can remember exactly what time it said it was on the clock.
Wow.
Or I can remember this overwhelming rush of blood running through my body, right? They can remember these sort of sensory details with great detail, but they often struggle to recall the traumatic event from start to finish. They say there are just gaps in my memory. There are these blocks. I can remember, you know, say the trauma occurred in a particular place. I can remember walking into it. I then don't remember what happened. Then I remember the smell. Then I remember someone screaming. Then I have this blank period, and then I was, you know, in an ambulance at the end. So it's like a puzzle, but not all the pieces of the puzzle are there.
That's also, like, as you're saying that, can be somewhat validating for people who have gone through hard times and not having the words to be able to articulate it as well, because you can kind of doubt yourself a little bit, being like, oh my gosh, like, what actually happened?
Yes.
And I mean, this is a slight tangent, but also it's related to traumatic events, like even, let's say, abuse, you know, like you not actually being able to step through the events, right? And it's like, okay, well, are they going to believe that person then? Because neurologically,
Yeah.
they couldn't actually remember. So it's like, where's the compassion in that?
Yes, yes. It's very hard to feel confident in yourself or to not feel sort of confused by certain traumatic experiences if you feel like your memory of it is not solid. And it's all to do with just how the brain encodes these memories. And it's why people get those flashbacks and those re-experiencing symptoms, because the smell, of that shop is so deeply encoded that then they walk past it years later, they get that same smell and it brings it all back. For example, I've worked with veterans who say, they've been in battle and there's a lot of smells that are out there. And then they walk past a butcher shop and they are completely back in a war zone because the smell of blood from the butcher shop reminds them of war. So, and that can happen years and years later.
So what isn't trauma?
This is a hard one to answer because I don't want to sit here and say to people like, that thing you went through, it's not trauma.
Totally.
Like you thought it was, but it's not, right?
Yeah.
Like
we're not here to invalidate anyone's experience, right?
Exactly. And it's that idea that trauma isn't just what happens to us, but it's what happens inside of us and the psychological wound that develops as a result of it. So, if you go and watch a movie and you feel really sad when you watch it, you're not traumatized by it. You might have emotions about it. You might feel overwhelmed by something. You might feel sad by something. Doesn't necessarily mean you're traumatized by it. I always come back to this analogy of the wound. Does it feel like a wound has developed for you as a result of the experience you went through? Or did it just feel really overwhelming and hard, but there's no wound that stays with you, right? These wounds, we carry them with us. They stay with us. They can be triggered up. They can heal, but as I said, they function like physical wounds that we might have. They're sensitive, they can be raw, but they can also heal with time. So someone's kind of questioning for themselves, isn't it trauma? Ask yourself the question, do I feel like I've got a wound as a result of it that's stayed with me for a period of time? Or was that just hard and overwhelming?
So it's really interesting because I would classify myself as someone that's highly sensitive and empathetic, right? So it's interesting you talk about the wound aspect after something that's happened, because then it gets me wondering, being like, okay, is there because I know previously in episodes you talk about, certain diagnoses of mental health conditions, and usually there's some kind of time period. So would you say that, let's say a wound lingers, like is there a specific time frame that it needs to be around for? Is it hard to kind of name something around that?
It's hard to put a time frame on it. When we think about those childhood traumas, those attachment traumas, those emotional wounds, those can be around through our whole adult life, particularly if they're not addressed. And the thing is that a lot of the time, particularly with those childhood wounds, they can be unconsciously being triggered up, right? We don't necessarily even have an awareness of them if we haven't done some of that self-reflective work.
And that kind of ties in quite beautifully to what I want to unpack a little bit more, because just around trauma responses, because why is it that some people respond so deeply to trauma versus other people where they might bounce back? Because I know you spoke to the childhood part, but is there any other factors?
Yes. So the childhood part is an important one, right? So the reason for this is that when we go through trauma as a child, we don't yet have the cognitive capacity in the brain to rationalize parts of it, right? So that's not to say that adults should just rationalize away, any traumas they go through in their adult life. But as children, we don't yet have that function in the brain. What we do have is the function related to emotion. Kids are very emotional, right? So they internalize traumatic experiences in a more emotional and self-identifying way. They are the center of their own world. If something happens to them, they internalize it as being potentially their fault or because of them or related to them in some way. And it's a highly emotionally encoded memory. That's different for adults who have more of a capacity to be able to rationalize, that person potentially was abusive and that's because they're a bad person. Children can't do that as well.
Yeah.
So to to answer your question, yes, when a trauma occurs, absolutely can impact sort of how someone deals with it. There's always that genetic and biological vulnerability. Some people are just more vulnerable, unfortunately, than other people. Some people have additional adverse experiences in life. So we think about adverse childhood experiences that just make it harder for them psychologically to cope in life by no fault of their own. I will also add to that the nature and the severity of the trauma can, of course, impact how someone recovers from it. But there are so many variances in all of that, right? Actually, one more thing I will add. It's not just all the negatives, right? It's also the protective factors that someone has in place that can help, right? How much support do they have in their life? Do they have spaces to be able to talk about the experiences that they've gone through? Do they have positive psychological resources that help them cope? You know, what are the kind of protective factors that someone also has? Because that can help them through the trauma.
For me, what I'm really curious about is there are a lot of phrases being thrown around in pop culture. Like, yes, we spoke about just trauma, but more specifically terms like, let's say trauma bonding. You know, that's a term that gets thrown around a lot. And I'd love to unpack that with you. What actually is trauma bonding?
Yes. So trauma bonding specifically comes up in the context of relationships. So we're talking about trauma as it relates to attachment between two people. And this is where there is essentially some sort of pattern of abuse that is occurring in a relationship. And it results in this very strong but very unhealthy emotional bond between two people. So there's two main factors that constitute a trauma bond in a relationship. So one is this notion of a power imbalance. So one person in the relationship has more power and control than the other person. The second part is that there's this pattern that gets played out where the person with power will do some quite nasty things towards the partner. But then they're also the person that kind of comes to the rescue. So I'll give you an example what I mean, right? So say the person who has that kind of power and control in the relationship says some really nasty and derogatory comments to, you know, their loved one. They say, oh, what are you wearing that outfit for? You look so ugly in that. Go and change. You shouldn't be wearing that, right? It's very nasty comments to make. That person goes off. They cry. They're upset. They change their outfit. The abusive partner then comes back in and says, oh, don't cry. I didn't mean it that way. Let me give you a hug. You know, you're beautiful. You know, it's okay. You can wear that original outfit, right? So I'm just giving one small example, but it's the person who kind of inflicts the abuse, but then also comforts the person. So people who are trauma bonded go through this roller coaster in their relationship of highs and lows. And it's through going through those highs and lows together that they form this really strong, but as I said, unhealthy bond between the two of them. And it also makes it very hard to then leave that relationship.
And it also is very confusing too, because they're playing both roles of the inflictor, but then also the rescuer or the solver.
Exactly. And it doesn't just have to be between romantic partners. It can be a parent and a child. This is also what we see a lot happen kind of in cults or in like Stockholm syndrome, where someone sort of develops this attachment for the person who is essentially keeping them captive or abusing them in some way. So there's a lot we can say about trauma bonding, but that's just sort of the outline of it.
I feel like, just as you mentioned about cults, I'm like, I feel like that's another whole episode.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So what about trauma dumping?
Trauma dumping.
Again, is that a clinical term?
The official clinical term. I diagnose you as a trauma dumper. So again, something that's made its way into kind of pop culture, but I guess we're referring to someone who has been through trauma, is going through a hard time dealing with their trauma, and obviously and understandably wants a space to talk about it. But unfortunately, what they do is sort of offload a lot of that to friends or people in their life without necessarily considering whether the person on the receiving end in that moment has the kind of capacity or bandwidth to actually receive all that trauma.
It's interesting because I feel like I've definitely been the kind of person where, you know, this isn't me pumping up my own tires here, but where I don't know, I feel like a lot of people share a lot of things with me, and which is lovely. And then
You're
also,
a good listener.
I'm a good listener, and it's an interesting one because I mean, a lot of the time I don't mind it, but I had a really tough period in my life where emotionally my capacity to listen to anything was really hard. So it's interesting knowing what's the balance between, okay, is this person trauma dumping, or am I just hearing them out? What I'm curious about too is it more likely people that trauma dump is because they're not getting the therapy that they need?
It could be.
Yeah, okay.
It could be, absolutely. They're obviously finding some benefit in talking about it.
Yeah, totally.
But when we think about trauma dumping, it's very kind of like one-sided. It's often kind of out of context as well, right? Like you might be catching up with a friend at a cafe and like suddenly they're talking about something really quite emotionally intense and in depth, and there's like people sitting like, you know, a half a meter away from you having their breakfast. So it's kind of out of context, and it's a bit like without consent as well. It's not like the person is saying, look, hey, I've been going through a tough time. Do you mind if we have a bit of a chat about it? I'd really love, you know, just for you to hear me out or for you to give me your opinion on things. Like it's not with the consent of the other person. It's just sort of, you know, drops.
Literally just dumping it on them.
Yeah. Sometimes it can also happen, I will say, because the person who's been through the trauma might actually be somewhat detached or desensitized to the traumatic experience itself. So for them, it doesn't feel like an overly emotional thing for them to talk about, or it doesn't feel overly traumatic. And I'm not saying that they're not traumatized. I'm saying that their way of coping might have actually been to shut off from those emotions. But so it doesn't actually feel that different to them, kind of like, you know, talking casually about a random topic over a coffee versus talking about something traumatic, because the emotional difference isn't there.
It kind of feels like, in a way, that you kind of need to give a trigger warning before you even have a conversation. Like, let's say, you know, you're at the cafe with your friend.
Yeah. Yes, you need to ask the consent. It's so funny you talk about trigger warnings, actually, because we certainly went through the phase where trigger warnings were, you know, before podcasts, at the start of podcasts, at the start of
presentations,
everything.
everything.
Absolutely. And if you notice nowadays, it's not really so much of a thing because the research is actually not there to support trigger warnings. You'll notice on this show we don't provide trigger warnings. Sometimes we'll just say to people, you know, listen mindfully, take care of yourself, but it's not a trigger warning because actually the research has shown that trigger warnings are not that effective, and they can actually have the opposite effect. They can actually increase anticipatory anxiety for people who might have some lived experience relevant to the topic before the content is actually sort of said or shown. So it kind of creates this anticipatory anxiety before they even watch the show or listen to the podcast. So actually it's a good reminder that just because something intuitively sort of seems like it might be a good idea, the research is not always there to support that it is.
So where do we even start when it comes to getting the right kind of help?
I'm a big advocate for going to your GP as the first point of contact, right? They're the professionals that will be able to help point you in the right direction to getting the treatment that you need. But it may involve seeing either a psychologist or a psychiatrist, or sometimes a combination of both, depending on whether you have trauma, PTSD, complex PTSD, depending on what the diagnosis specifically is, the treatment that you receive will differ. And definitely in this kind of takeaway part here, I'm not here to tell anyone that you can cure your trauma in, you know, the 10 minutes that you're going to spend listening to this next bit, because trauma is complex, it's complicated, it's deeply personal, it affects people in so many different ways and really needs to be handled quite sensitively. The good news is that we have a lot of evidence-based treatments that show good effect when it comes to healing from trauma and treating PTSD.
So you mentioned before in a lot of your clinical work that you've helped people move through trauma. I guess what I'm trying to say is, like, how do you embrace life after trauma? Like, can we?
Yes. What does life after trauma look like? What can it look like?
Yeah.
Right? Because it can look like a lot of different things. But actually, I like this conversation because there's something called post-traumatic growth. And I think this is important to bring into the conversation because trauma gets talked about a lot, but post-traumatic growth doesn't necessarily get the same amount of airtime.
No.
So post-traumatic growth was a term that was coined by two psychologists, Richard Tedeschi and Lawrence Colloon, and they developed this idea in the 90s. And it was this notion that there are key areas in a person's life where after experiencing trauma, they can actually have some positive moments of growth, and I kind of want to say revelation for themselves as well. So while this is not at all to invalidate or take away the pain of the trauma itself, but as part of going through that healing process of trauma, there can be post-traumatic growth, which is nice to know.
That is nice to know. Gives us hope. So what does post-traumatic growth actually look like?
Yeah, so it's broken down into kind of growth in 5 different areas of a person's life. And what I sometimes recommend people to do is not just kind of think about these 5 areas for themselves, but actually maybe kind of do a little bit of journaling and self-reflection around these areas. So the first area that the psychologists identified was around appreciation of life. So this is the idea of someone kind of having this renewed sense of gratitude for life. I mean, we hear this a lot from people who may have gone through, near-death experiences or very serious illnesses, people who've survived cancer, things like this, where on the other side of their treatment, they kind of have this new appreciation for life, this idea of like savor all the small moments because you don't know when, they might be taken away from you. So some of the questions you can kind of reflect on to help you think about this, are there any moments or experiences in my life now that I value more deeply post-trauma as opposed to before my trauma? Are there any things in my life that maybe I was taking for granted that now I can reflect on and go, you know what, I'm actually really grateful. I appreciate those small moments in my day, the things that I was, just kind of going through my day, passing by, not thinking much about. I really value and appreciate them now.
It really does give you a new perspective.
Yes, absolutely. So that's the first one, about appreciation for life. The next one is about relationships and improved relationships. So some people might find that with post-traumatic growth, they have a greater sense of not just appreciation, but empathy and compassion for others. Again, sometimes going through or witnessing something traumatic does shift our perspective, and it shifts our perspective not just on life, but how we relate to other people and how we feel about other people's suffering. We all suffer in life. It's part of being human. We can't avoid it, but we can sometimes develop a greater compassion for other people's suffering. So you might ask yourself questions to reflect on, like, how have my relationships changed, perhaps for the better, post-trauma? How have I changed in terms of how I show up in relationships for the better post-trauma? So again, some kind of prompts to reflect on.
I love that. What about the third one?
The third one is all about new possibilities.
Oh, I like that one.
Yeah. So again, we see that sometimes people during this post-traumatic growth phase might consider new experiences, new hobbies, new life paths that they hadn't considered before. It might be that they try out a new career. It might be that they try new activities. There's this kind of openness. If we think about that personality structure that we've talked about before, that personality trait around openness, we find that in post-traumatic growth, some people might have a new sense of openness to different things in their life. So again, you can kind of reflect on what new interests or hobbies or opportunities could I discover in this post-traumatic growth phase? Are there maybe kind of bigger pursuits in my life that I'd thought about or considered prior to the trauma that now I feel like I have some sort of motivation to pursue further?
It's really interesting. And again, it kind of, I know you already spoke to it around, it's not around diluting, or invalidating people's experiences of the traumatic events that they've gone through. But there was something you mentioned before around this is happening to me.
Mm.
And a reframe as well on that is also, why is this happening for me? And it's like, oh, okay, what are the lessons I'm getting? And, what you're already speaking to is, there's this renewed sense of purpose and perspective and character as well, which is, it's really nice to see that side of the equation too.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely.
Okay, what about the fourth one?
The fourth one is all around personal strength. And when I say personal strength, I'm really kind of referring to these internal characteristics around, resilience, a sense of being able to survive difficult things, right? These kind of character strengths that we can lean on that go, you know what, I'm really proud of myself for having these personal character traits and these personal strengths. So you could ask yourself about, what situations post-trauma have I been through where I've really kind of been impressed with myself or surprised myself with how well I've dealt with that, or how well I've coped with it, or how resilient I've been as a result of it, or what sort of skills or qualities within myself have I further developed and refined that I'm really proud of myself for.
I love that. I mean, I'm really loving all of these. I'm actually really excited to do this, maybe on my train ride.
Yes.
Do some journaling.
Get out the journal. Okay. And then the last one is about kind of a spiritual or existential change. So when I say spiritual, I don't necessarily mean religious, although it can be for some people. But it's this idea of sometimes something bigger than us, right? This sense of having some sort of purpose in life, that there's maybe something bigger than us in life. And these existential thoughts that can come about that are not necessarily dark and scary, but can actually be really helpful for us. So this one is all about meaning, purpose, and values, as we come back to very often in our chats.
It's important.
Shani. Yeah, this kind of reframing of, what are my values? What are the things that are deeply important to me? How can I lean further into those, into my life post-trauma? What is my sense of purpose in life? Where do I find my purpose in life? How do I find that? How do I lean into it? So all these kind of bigger picture, more sometimes existential questions can be helpful for people to reflect on, to feel that deeper sense of meaning post-trauma.
It's like what they say around, like, how often you can find your purpose from pain.
Yes.
As well.
Yes. If I can share an example from one of the best books I ever read, Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl. He's a psychiatrist in World War II. He's in a Nazi concentration camp, and he has a manuscript that he's written of a book, and he wants to publish it and release it to the world. And for him, this is this big sense of purpose, and having that purpose psychologically helps him through all the trauma that he experiences. And then, post surviving the war, he's able to kind of pursue that. But he talks a lot about this sense of holding on to meaning and being able to find meaning during and post trauma as a way to help us through it.
We've reached that time in our episode where we answer a question or dilemma from one of you, our listeners. This dilemma comes from Tina.
Every time my friend and I catch up, the conversation turns heavy. She ends up trauma dumping, and honestly, it's starting to wear me down. I care about her and I do want to be there, but I'm not always in the right headspace to take on so much. Lately, it's been affecting my own mental health, and I'm not sure how to bring it up without hurting her feelings or making her feel like I don't care. I just need a bit of balance. How do I set boundaries without making her feel like I'm shutting her out?
Oh, Tina.
Oh, this is hard.
This is hard. Absolutely. Look, I understand the situation that you're in. It sounds like you're a good friend because you keep catching up with her. But you obviously want to balance your needs as well as her needs. So look, I think if in doubt, have a conversation. That's kind of my takeaway here. Maybe just choose a time and place to have a conversation with your friend about this. It's obviously a big topic and a sensitive topic for her. So approach it with sensitivity. But I would encourage you just sort of reflecting back to her a bit of what you've heard her say, so like, look, I know you have been going through a really hard time with your ex through this divorce, and it's really all consuming. I know you've been telling me a lot about it, right? So just tell her what she's been telling you so that she knows you're listening. And then let her know your limits. Lean into, I love you as a friend. I want to be here to support you. But there are just some times where I don't have the capacity to be that ear for you, to listen to what's going on, or to be able to sort of provide you with the support and advice and guidance that perhaps you need in that moment. I love you, but I can't always do it. And then kind of ask for some sort of shared understanding, right? Like, because this is some sort of like negotiation process you want to engage in. So, is it okay that if you feel like you want to talk about the divorce and your ex, that you tell me that's what we're going to chat about, so that I can let you know if I've got capacity in this day or in this moment to be able to talk with you about it? And is it okay if you sort of understand that maybe sometimes there's going to be situations where I've just got a lot going on in my own head that I'm not going to be able to be that emotional support for you? Just see how she responds to that. You could also follow up with trying to help her find other supports, like other friends or other people you can get support, advice, guidance from. Have you considered talking to a professional about this? There are other ways in which you can really look after you, because I do care about you. I just need to communicate with you that I have my limits too.
Good luck, Tina, with the conversation. We know you're going to do so well. Anastasia, can you reiterate the main takeaways from today's episode?
So first of all, it's important for us to understand what trauma is and what trauma isn't. Second, trauma can develop into PTSD or complex PTSD. Third, sharing and talking about trauma has a place in friendships and relationships, but with boundaries. And lastly, if you get the right help, you can overcome trauma and really thrive in your life.